thanks. Did you rush back?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
We're good?
We're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Well, good evening, and thank you so much for being patient and waiting while we got that figured out. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christy Steffi. I'm the parking superintendent, and I've been with the city for 18 years, and I'm excited to be here today to continue our conversation on the residential parking program. This is something that we originally started in 2021, and then this is our third community meeting. We did hit some delays in our progress, so we're back here to revisit this and start the conversation again, get some feedback. So our first meeting was in April 2021, and the second meeting was in September 2021. And then so now we're taking that feedback. We've gathered some more feedback. We have a survey that is open currently, that opened in January and will close on April 10th. So we are gathering that information as well. We're fortunate to have with us here today Julie Dixon from Dixon Resources Unlimited, who's been working closely with the city since 2018. Julie will be leading the discussion tonight, and we're grateful to have her expertise and continued support. And we also with her is Ben Verdugo, who is going to also be her assistant in the project, and is our project manager. I also would like to introduce Lee Bradley. She is our new assistant parking superintendent, and I'll give her a chance to introduce herself in just a moment. Our primary objective for tonight is to provide you with information about the potential changes to the residential parking program and to encourage collaboration and discussion. We'll be sharing some of the ideas we've been considering, including possible changes to permit limits, the introduction of paid permits, the transition to online permit system. These are all still under consideration, and tonight is an opportunity to hear your thoughts and feedback and get suggestions as we work together to shape the future of the program. As we move through tonight's discussion, please feel free to ask questions, to share your thoughts, and to give us your feedback. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Lee to do an introduction of herself as well.
Thank you, Christy. Hi, I'm Lee. I'm new to the city and new to parking. So I'm just really excited to be here and hear everybody's feedback and learn. I am on the Have Your Say page for Monterey for the parking permit program. So I look at it every day. Any question you have, feedback or comments, you can post it in there and I will get back to you very quickly.
Perfect.
That's all.
And all right. And then I'll give that to Julie to go ahead and do an introduction. Oh, Renee, would you? In the audience, we have Renee Mendez. She is our parking enforcement supervisor.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Christy. So I'll do my Bob Barker impression here as much as I possibly can. And thank you again. My name is Julie Dixon, as Christy mentioned, and we have been working with the city now for a number of years. And I am going to make sure that there we go. Perfect. Okay. So as I mentioned to the group just before we started, when we do, what I'm going to ask is that we'll just hold our questions till after I have a very brief presentation, because what I would like to request is when you do have commentary, if you will come up to the microphone, just because we are streaming and recording tonight's meeting. So we do want to make sure that everybody can hear your commentary and feedback. I'm happy to try to mimic what you said, but it's always better when we can hear straight from you all. And I will ask this, our group is rather small tonight. I will just ask that if everyone will be mindful, we want to give everyone a chance to participate. So, we won't necessarily put like a 3-minute time limit on anybody necessarily, but we will ask that we just, again, share the microphone so that everybody has a chance to participate tonight. And then one other thing that I always like to share before we launch into a discussion like tonight, where it's really important because this is where you all live, is to recognize that everyone has priorities. They might be different than your own. And we just ask that everybody be respectful of everyone's opinion and feedback tonight, even if it isn't the same as your own, because what's really important about this process moving forward is we really want to develop a holistic solution that's going to work for your neighborhoods and for your community as a whole. And so that's why it's really critical that we hear feedback from everyone. And it's why I really want to reinforce, and you'll hear me talk about the survey a couple times. Christy already mentioned it. The online survey, we're going to share a couple snippets from it today just to kind of give you some vibes of what we're hearing so far. But the survey is open until April 10th. We encourage everyone to go online and to fill out that survey. If you want to go on to Nextdoor or any of your neighborhood groups, please make sure that you encourage everyone to fill out that survey, because that information will help inform and influence the direction of the program. So with that, as Christy mentioned, Dixon Resources Unlimited, we are parking consultants. My colleague Ben actually used to run the City of San Diego's parking program, including all of the parking benefits districts, of which also residential parking was a big component, as you can appreciate, especially with some of the very popular business areas that we had in San Diego. We work with communities all across the country, but with a particular influence and directive here in California. You're going to hear me talk quite a bit about some of the legislative changes that have already taken place in California and some of the things that are coming down the pipeline. I like to share this information with all of you as residents, because it is very important that you know what has happened legally in California, and when we talk about how to manage these items moving forward, because a lot has changed pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and we'll talk a lot about that. And I will share with you that right now we probably have about at least half a dozen projects with residential neighborhoods in California where we're helping them, I'll just call it rebuild or redesign their residential parking permit programs, with the understanding that there's a lot of unknowns about what's going to happen in California as the legislation continues to change. And without going too deep into it yet, if anyone has paid attention to the requirements, what are called parking minimums. So today, when you build a new home, back in the day, you used to have to build a certain number of parking spaces as it relates to the number of beds or bedrooms associated with development. And one of the laws that changed a few years ago was if you have a development within a half a mile of a transit stop, and transit stop is very loosely defined, you do not have to provide any parking. So that is a really big change from how things have been done historically. And we could sit here and debate with about our legislators on whether or not people are still going to have cars or not. I know I do this for a living, and everyone I ask, no one's raised their hand and told me they're getting rid of their car anytime soon. So I jokingly say I will have a job for the rest of my career because of the fact that we're basically just setting ourselves up for conflict, because we're building without parking and people still have their cars. And so you can all appreciate that challenge. And so it's important when we talk about policies moving forward is that we also have to be mindful of not setting the city up for future civil action as well. Some cities are already starting to dabble with maybe certain restrictions that would prevent what are called TDM or transit development, basically focused developments like these ones within a half a mile of a transit stop, trying to prevent them from participating in future residential parking permit programs. And the paperwork is already being filed to say that that would be a violation of those residents' rights. So I say this not to, be contentious, but this is the reality of the state in which we live, and that's why there's no perfect answer. And I just say that with you all because when we talk about having an adaptive, balanced solution and trying to, in some cases, fit a square peg into a round hole is a bit of what we're challenged by. So I share that because this is why it's so imperative that you all are here tonight so that we can collaborate and figure out how we can make this work in Monterey. So importantly, and I was speaking with one of your neighbors just before the meeting started, it's really important to really understand what is important about parking in Monterey. And one of the things that happened when we first started working here was really to focus on what I will call the tourist impacted or commercial districts. Some of you may have noticed there's been a lot of changes over the last several years. The waterfront parking lot, we've had some evolutions with the technology, the signage. We'll talk a little bit about the technology that our parking enforcement officers use now. This is all what I think I like to describe the building bricks or the foundation of a very robust parking program, so that now our ability to help tackle the challenges of what you all are facing in your neighborhoods is something that we basically have the resources and toolbox or toolkit to now begin to address what some of those impacts are. And one of the other challenges that has really evolved post pandemic has been the issue of the number of people that are living in their cars, and that basically are juggling the 72-hour violations and pushing the limit just so when it comes to knowing when to move their cars and where to move their cars. And I will say that this is not unique to Monterey, and it's something that many, many, many cities throughout the state are challenged by, but we'll definitely talk about how to tackle that. And it's important when we talk about what the immediate impact is, as well as the future impact. And one of the things the team and I were speaking just before we came over here, and the one thing that's important, maybe by show of hands, how many people in the audience today currently have a residential parking permit program in their neighborhood? Thank you. About half, I'd say. So one of the things that as we talk about policies moving forward, sometimes the residential parking permit programs can create some headaches. Like if I want to have guests over, if I want to have a dinner party, versus maybe the people that don't have a permit zone that maybe can never find a parking space when they want to have friends over. So you can see it's really finding that right size balance. And that's what's really important when we talk about trying to develop an adaptive solution. And this is why when we talk about this number one bullet on the parking roadmap is the end user experience. You all, even as residents, you are customers. And I think it's really important when we talk about parking is that I call parking a customer service experience. And whether you're having guests over, a dinner party, or grandma's coming over for a visit, it's really about trying to make sure that parking is a positive part of that experience. Nothing is more frustrating when, you start pulling your hair out because you can't find a parking space when you're going to your destination. So when we talk about that, it's really important. But the one piece of this, and this is why I'm so glad that we're back here today, Christy, so thank you. The whole concept of Rome wasn't built in a day. Our opportunity to tackle this incrementally, I can assure you of the fact that now this project is really at the tippy top of the list. And so our ability to really move the needle, and when we get the results from the survey, it's really going to be critical. So when we talk about the project background, it's important to recognize that our residential parking permit program has been around since the 80s. And what's happened is when we talk about the model and kind of how it's grown, something that has occurred is that as the program has expanded, it was intended to really, again, make parking more convenient and available for our residents. And one of the things that we know we want to do on the immediate as we talk about rebuilding and maybe redesigning the program is take the program online. The reason why that's relevant is because one of the things that some of you may know is that the city has begun to use license plate recognition technology. You might hear me call it LPR technology. And what that does is it allows us to cover more ground because your license plate is basically a unique identifier to your car, and your license plate is basically your parking permit. And so what this does is it basically really simplifies your experience on parking because your license plate basically becomes your parking permit. And then what this also does is it allows you to manage your parking experience online. You no longer have to come down to the parking office or have to wait for a decal or a hang tag to be mailed to you or anything like that. Basically, your license plate becomes your parking permit. And what you're seeing across the country is that transition from a physical parking permit to a virtual parking permit, or what we call permit by plate, is really the direction that we're heading in. And as we also start to talk about some of the benefits and values of some of our other programs, like our locals discount program, being able to try to tie that into our license plate is all part of that evolution. And I know, Christy, you brought some flyers to share for later on today as well, or is that for tonight? Yes, we'll leave those on the table for everyone later. And that was about the locals discount program, right? I didn't want you to forget those since you had printed those out. So that transition is really key, and really taking that paper aspect of the process out of the picture. Those of you that still want to come to the parking office and see this great team, you're still welcome to do that. But the reality of having the conveniences of doing things online is really key. Now let's talk about the policies. The policies haven't been updated for a very long time. And when we start to talk about the modifications of these policies, there's a lot of things that other programs have done very successfully as we talk about the modification to the program. One of the keys here is actually establishing a cap or a maximum number of permits that are eligible per household. And one of the items that I was sharing with the team that has worked very effectively in other communities, and in fact, I was sharing that the city of Cerritos and the city of San Mateo have had this model for more than, I believe, 3 decades. In those communities, and many more now, only licensed drivers are eligible to have a parking permit. And I share this because if I live by myself and I have 4 cars, I am only eligible for 1 parking permit. And this is one of those factors that basically puts the burden of the storage of those 3 other cars on my shoulders, not upon the public domain. And so this has really started to have a real benefit in the communities that we've deployed this in. And I will tell you that using this model in Cerritos and San Mateo, we've now been modeling this now for about half a dozen years, and it's worked really efficiently because many of you have shared your concerns about the 72-hour violations, the cars that never move. And that's tends to be the cars that, again, I've got a 3rd or 4th car, and, me being able to juggle those. I'll also plant the seed here to talk about street sweeping. Most communities have posted street sweeping regulations. And this is important when we talk about, stormwater runoff, environmental conditions, factors like that. And our hope is, as we talk about kind of this big bite of the apple, is that we might be able to start to look at consistent street sweeping policies by block face. So this is something also when we talk about some of those longer term overstay vehicles, when you talk about permit zones, you also have more fluidity, more movement of those vehicles as well. And we're assuring that your curbs are being cleaned as well, and the street sweepers aren't just going around those cars. The annual renewal process is something, like I mentioned, if we go more towards the online realm, is that all of these resources can be done online. What's really nifty about the vendor system that the city of Monterey employs is that when my car is registered my home address, I can log on with my credentials, and when I enter in my license plate, it actually does a DMV verification within seconds. And I've seen it happen where when my plate matches my registered owner address, my permit fulfillment happens literally instantaneous because the address matches. Now, that isn't always the case. I could be a renter, or I could, have been subletting a location, whatever the case may be. It just takes a couple of extra steps, and it maybe takes me 2 minutes rather than 20 seconds. But this is what's really nice about that process. And when we talk about long-term residents, it doesn't necessarily require you to requalify every year. So when we talk about these online processes, typically when you're a long-term resident, you register one time, and then there's either that annual or every other year renewal process, whatever that could look like. The other piece of this is the size of the RPP zones. As we talk about assessing this process, it's really about determining the appropriate size. And also what we will talk is kind of taking some of the barriers down when we talk about residential parking permit zones, or you'll hear me call it RPP zones. What's important about this factor is in 2016, the California State Attorney General published an opinion. Now, it is only an opinion, but I want everyone here to know that a large majority of cities have applied this opinion in practice. And the opinion is that you cannot differentiate between a multifamily or a single family dwelling. And what has happened in many communities is they have basically not allowed multifamily dwellings, condominiums, townhomes, apartment buildings from participating in residential parking permit programs. So what this opinion basically said is you can't distinguish between multifamily and single family, that programs like these have to be fair and equitable to everyone. And so a lot of communities have gone in and adapted and modified their policies to basically ensure that everyone has access to participate in those programs. So yes, that does mean that in some cases, apartment buildings would be able to participate in permit zones as well. And so that's important when we talk about, again, making sure it's a balanced scale. That's really how it comes into play. So Christy mentioned this, but I wanted to highlight what we've been working on already this year. So you see those municipal codes. I think anybody that is familiar with a city process, municipal code update is a bit of a heavy lift, but it's important that we want to make sure that we call it future proofing the municipal code for whatever could come. And then when we bring those municipal codes forward, which right now it's proposed for there at the beginning of summer, when the municipal codes do come before city council, there's 2 reads. So it basically takes about a 60-day process. So when you look through this process and going with the city attorney and all of those factors, ultimately, the goal is for council to hear the first reading by June, and we'd be looking at hopefully adoption of those updated municipal codes by the end of summer, give or take. Now, what's important about those municipal code updates is we've done a preliminary review of what's written today, but this is where your feedback is also very critical, this and the survey. This is the reason why we're not taking those recommendations forward until we basically get through our community meetings and also the surveys so that we can adapt and modify any other changes. This first review is basically kind of like what's wrong, what's missing, what's needed. And then once we have the feedback and, the results from tonight's meeting, as well as online and the survey, we'll then basically modify that and then basically begin to draft our updated recommendations as policy should be affected. And then ultimately bringing that information to council in June. I'll mention this today and I'll also share it at the end of the presentation. We do have a project webpage, which it'll come up on the screen at the end of tonight's presentation, where you'll be able to reference any of the details of the project at that location, and we'll make sure it's modified and updated with any refresh or any new information about the project as well. But you can see that this opportunity to gather community feedback is critical. And I say this because a program can only be successful if it's designed around the community's needs. And that's why your feedback tonight and going through the survey is so important and why we encourage participation. So why do we have a residential parking permit program? The goal is so that residents can park near their homes where parking is limited. I was sharing with the team that as we've worked through some other communities on residential parking permit challenges, one of the programs that actually just recently won a big national award, it was the city of Costa Mesa. The city of Costa Mesa, when we launched that project several years ago, they had 71 permit zones in the city. When the program was all said and done, they ended up with about 21 permit zones because what ended up happening was historically residential parking permit programs were allowed to be implemented because I wanted to exclude multifamily from the locations, or I just wanted to make sure I don't want that neighborhood parking on my block. So a lot of kind of traditional single family neighborhoods were able to design programs that really kind of built basically mini walls around the city. And it was in Costa Mesa that as we went through the community feedback to determine what the impacts were that were driving the need for a parking permit program, we ended up with what we call the big 3, these 3 rules that help to dictate or determine if a residential parking permit program is needed. And we've now taken these 3 rules and applied them across the country for that matter. And I'll share what those 3 are. And hopefully these will make it really simple to understand. The first rule is if there is a neighboring or adjacent city that basically spills over into your neighborhood where you're parked, you're basically buttressed up against a neighboring city and their parking is spilling into your neighborhood. That was rule number one. If you had an impact like that from a neighboring city, that would be a driver or a cause for a request for a residential parking permit program. The second rule would be maybe you live adjacent to a commercial district or a business district where there's shops and restaurants that you have an influence or an influx of people that want to go to those shops and those stores. And the third rule of thumb was what we call the impacts of a venue. And a venue could be a fairground, a high school, an entertainment venue, a naval academy, a Navy post, something like that. And so those three rules were basically the drivers in Costa Mesa that basically required everybody to re-qualify for their parking permit program. Now, when I mentioned that, we also had other rules that came into play, like you couldn't omit apartment buildings or condominiums. A lot of things changed, but the other piece that was really important, and I'm going to share this because I might get booed off the couch here or off the table, is that Costa Mesa's parking permits used to be free. And that is a really big challenge because when I met Lee here tonight, and Lee's just started in the parking industry, the first thing that I said to Lee is there's no such thing as free parking. And I share that because when you talk about a residential parking permit program, there's signage, there's enforcement, there's parking permits. There's a lot that goes into a residential parking program. And oftentimes, and we've already seen this in the survey results, people want more enforcement, they want less enforcement. There's a lot of services that go along with a residential parking program. But what's important about fees associated with a residential parking permit program is California Proposition 26. It's called the hidden tax proposition. And basically what Proposition 26 states is that a parking permit can't be just considered another tax, but a parking permit has to be designed to be sustainable, where the fees basically cover the cost of a program. And so this can't be the city coming out and say, we're going to charge you hundreds of dollars for a parking permit. But what you basically do is you develop a price model that equates to the services and support associated with that. And what we've seen in most communities, being able to launch a permit program for $25 for an annual parking permit, we're not talking about astronomical numbers, but we do know and anticipate that there will be recommendations associated with fees with parking permits. I will also highlight we haven't launched a single program yet that did not have a low income option as well associated with that program. So those are all factors that when we talk about fee structures, and I just want to be very transparent with everyone when we talk about what we're anticipating in terms of the direction of the program. So when we talk about how do you start a residential parking permit program on your street, the city has a very consistent model with other agencies with a couple of exceptions. What you typically have to do is you have to go out and establish a petition where you go door to door, sign up your neighbors and say, hey, do you guys want to have a parking permit program on our blocks, and sign here. But what's unique about the city of Monterey is that today you only need basically 50% plus one to sign that petition. I will share with you that most other agencies, that percentage is higher because you want to, again, ensure that you have a good majority of the neighborhood that want to participate in that program. Other communities also have rules in regards to how big the zone has to be. And in some cases, using Costa Mesa as the example, with the exception of geographic impacts, there had to be 4 contiguous blocks to be able to even establish a petition. So in their case, it would be 4 contiguous blocks, 70% of that neighborhood had to sign a petition to even be considered for a parking permit program. But in your case, the way the rules are written today, once the petition is submitted, that is when the parking division goes out and completes a parking occupancy study where they go out and basically count the number of cars. And we're going to talk a little bit about data here tonight to determine what the occupancy is. Ideally, we're counting cars at different times of the day, different days of the week, so that we can identify that our occupancy exceeds 70% to determine the need of a parking permit program. Yes, ma'am. So the question was, what about the size of the vehicles? That is an outstanding question. And I will share with you that there's different rules by different cities, and some cities have established oversized vehicle ordinances that include not only length, but also height. So that's something that can definitely be considered. I will also share that in many programs, for permitted programs, there are certain types of vehicles that are not eligible for a parking permit as well. And so in that parking occupancy study, what would typically happen in most cities is that the evaluator or assessor would make observations as well. For example, in some neighborhoods, you might have a lot of trucks and trailers, or we have some communities where there's a lot of like landscaping vehicles with, all of the tools and traders, commercial vehicles. So those are things that we'd like to be sure to make observations of. And in fact, I know Christy's going to love me for suggesting this one. In some densely populated communities, we've had a lot of requests for cities to actually paint what we call the T's or the L's in the street, so that way you can identify the space demarcations for like the size of the vehicles that basically are authorized, because we have people infringing on driveways and such, making it difficult to turn. I'll also mention Assembly Bill 413. If you're not familiar with the daylighting ordinance, that went into effect in law January 1st of this year, where you cannot park within 20 feet of an intersection. I have to highlight to anyone listening or here today, the curb does not have to be painted. There does not have to be a sign. You just are not allowed to park within 20 feet of an intersection. I will share that the T's and the L's, I love them. They're also very expensive. We have a community that just completed about half of a neighborhood, and it was a really expensive endeavor, and it took probably about 3 months to just get half of the neighborhood done. And it's one of those things you'll have to repaint it the next year and the year over. But these are all things that when you do start to talk about the monetization of a parking permit program, ideally what can help pay and fund for those types of opportunities as well. But the sizes of the vehicles will be something that definitely can be tied into the policies for sure. And we're seeing more and more communities putting up restrictions regarding the size of vehicles, trailers, etc. So RVs for sure. We'll absolutely talk tonight a little bit about RVs and vehicle habitation challenges, because we definitely received some feedback already on that. Yep, that own their RVs and want to. So the question is, just for those who are online, is about RVs and on-street storage as well. I will share with you that most communities have what's called an RV permit that basically allows, I think most communities have between 4 to 6 permits per household, that every year you can apply for these parking permits where I'm allowed to have my RV on street for up to 48 hours, because I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, if we went camping, the RV would pull up in front of the house, we'd load it up, and then we'd go off on our trip. We'd come back, we'd unload the RV. So now in today's world, you can actually have a parking permit that allows for that, 24 or 48 hour storage. And that's typically the only time that you'll have the opportunity to have an RV or an oversized vehicle on street. And that's definitely a standard of most permit programs, but also most neighborhoods that have any restrictions on oversized vehicle. Great question. So getting back to the petitioning process, once you have had the occupancy study met, and if it meets all of the requirements, there's one thing that's missing here, is that you've checked all the boxes, then it goes to city council for approval, and I'll call it ratification for this to be approved, and ultimately before the signs can go up. Now I'm going to add one other step that has transpired in many of the communities that we've worked in. There's one step that's missing here, is that even after the location has been confirmed, thumbs up on everything, the one requirement that other communities have implemented is that signs cannot go up until 51% of the residents in that zone have purchased a parking permit. And I say this because what's happened in the history of residential parking permit programs is that folks have petitioned because they wanted to keep all of those people off of their blocks. They did all the petitioning process. They didn't need the on-street parking. They just didn't want anybody else parking on their streets. And then when the program went live, they never bought a parking permit, and it basically created all sorts of inventory. Nobody parked there. So the reality of the participation in the program is really key as well. And those are things that will be considered as we talk about moving the program forward. Sorry, I clicked the wrong way. So how can I get a residential parking permit in my neighborhood that is already a part of the program? The real key here is proof of residency. That includes a utility bill, a lease, a mortgage statement, a rental agreement, valid photo ID, and valid registration for each vehicle. And this is something that, again, when we are able to take this program online, you'll be able to submit that documentation online to be able to have that credentialing. And which streets in Monterey already have a residential parking program? Currently, there are 18 residential parking permit zones in Monterey. And is there a fee? At this time, there is no fee, but we are exploring the possibility of introducing a nominal fee to help support the program. And I do want to reinforce again, because of Proposition 26, it has to be a sustainable model to basically be able to be designed to pay for the program. So what is ALPR? As I mentioned, a license plate recognition technology or automated license plate recognition technology, and how does it work in a residential parking permit program? So again, because our cars are uniquely identified by our license plates, your license plate becomes your parking permit. And a lot of communities have called this permit by plate. It's a really simple way that your license plate is a one-stop shop for where you're eligible to park. And when the license plate recognition technology drives down the street, the simplest way that I can explain how it works is that as the camera goes by your vehicle, the camera system goes, this car parks here, this car can't park here. There's no looking up and saying, oh, that's Ben Verdugo's car or that's Julie Dixon's car. None of that. The system is simply saying, good to park, not good to park. And that's really the basics of how the technology works. There's no magic theory or looking up of DMV records, none of that. It's just a good or a bad. And if it's a bad, the system sends a trigger to the enforcement officer that says, take action, write a citation, write a warning notice, whatever that particular aspect may be required. And it really simplifies it, and it allows us to provide more coverage. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit tonight about 72-hour enforcement. This is important too because the California Vehicle Code states that we must move our cars basically every 72 hours. That is a California Vehicle Code. And what the LPR can do is the LPR can identify vehicles that have overstayed that 72 hours. Now, I will highlight this. This becomes an agency or a city policy. Most agencies only respond on 72-hour violations based on complaint. Typically, most agencies have so much work to do that they're not out there proactively hunting for 72-hour violations, with the exception of egregious vehicles that have cobwebs growing out of them, their tires are melting into the asphalt and pavement. Those are typically the ones that create, we call it urban blight, and that is when they will go through the notification process. It's important for anyone that's ever received a 72-hour violation is to understand, I can't just come across your car and say, gosh, that car looks like it's been here for a really long time. I'm going to take action. That is not how that works. There is a notification process that's required. I have to notice the vehicle when I see it, and then I have to wait at least 72 hours before I can take action. I can assure you of the fact that also the city program takes proactive stances to try to, again, message and connect so that people can get their cars moved. The real challenge are what I call the wheel rollers, where the person has what is a car that is derelict and really shouldn't be on the street, and they're going out there and moving their wheels, right? Back in the olden days, people used to go out and rub the chalk off the tires. But this is something that's really invaluable about the ALPR technology that I mentioned, is the reality of having to move the car a significant amount. The LPR technology provides the digital footprint that I now have the images associated with that vehicle, so that ultimately, if you're trying to game the system, ultimately the city can take action and we have the evidence necessary to be able to tow the car if it comes down to that. But we're talking about derelict vehicles. Yes, ma'am.
And the parking fee, the ticket, how is that determined?
Good question. So the question was how far the car basically has to move. And the second question was the fees associated with it. So I'll talk about the fees first. So first and foremost is the penalty schedules are basically established by the city council, and it's part of the fee schedule associated with any of the penalties associated with parking violations. When you tow a vehicle, there's also tow fees that are associated with that are also included in that fee schedule as well. And having been a parking enforcement officer, the vehicle has to basically move a substantial amount. And typically it's about a block face. And based on the city's rules, 150 foot is basically the simplest way to start with it. And I'm just looking at Christy to see, or to Renee, if you all have any other standards when it comes to 72-hour impounds or actions of how far the car needs to move. 150 feet. So there's our actual answer with that as well too. So, and I will share that if you receive a notice on your car, maybe your car broke down, something has happened, I highly encourage you to not ignore the notices, to contact the parking division, because if there needs to be a conversation about, you have arrangements, these are all things, again, that being able to work with the community to help them navigate the situation. Again, just don't ignore the notices. Yes, Renee? 300 feet. Okay, correction for those that are extreme, 300 feet on the movement of the vehicle. So, but I want to really reinforce, and Renee, I'll just look at you, the proactive actions versus based on complaint. With the description that I gave about looking for like the dilapidated vehicles, is there anything that you would state that would be different to what I described? Yep.
The protocol on the vehicle on one street will put it on the entire street. In a residential area, of course, or towards the residents, but there would really come the ones who
Proved to be the challenge. Great.
don't return to issue citations across the board.
So what Renee has shared for those that are online is that the actions are taken based on complaint, and the reactions of being able to chalk all of the cars and looking for that movement of the vehicles as well, not targeting specific cars, but again, based on complaint, and then the decrepit vehicle that I described, taking action on those as well. So perfect. Thank you. Just want to make sure everybody online could hear you as well. So then what is a virtual permit? What I described before, again, our license plates being unique identifiers and the license plate becoming our permit for our car. And then what I wanted to share with you is when we talk about occupancy studies, and I know the map is a little bit small here. We'll keep that in mind for our next presentation because we don't need to see as much water per se. That's good to know. I can't see the otters right now, but what you basically see is some colors. I want to highlight the colors because when I talked about the ALPR technology, what we're actually able to do is not only go out there and enforce time limit zones, looking for parking permits and everything that I described, but we're also counting the cars to determine what our occupancy levels are by block face. And when you see a lot of blue, that's a good thing because it basically means the code on the bottom left corner is that our occupancies are basically less than 50%. Now, again, I know that these maps are really small with the lighting here, but where you can see some red and some yellow, The reason why the red is particularly important is because in the parking industry, when you're at 85% occupancy, it basically means you're near or at capacity, and when the city needs to start making parking management decisions. This is important. So as we start to talk about how to manage parking moving forward, we want to make sure that the city's making data-driven decisions. It's not just about my opinion or your opinion. It's what does the data show? So using the example of, if I want to apply to have a parking permit program, we could actually go out at multiple times of the day and night and be able to actually identify the occupancy and the car counts by utilizing the LPR technology. Importantly, for total occupancy, basically for data collected through March, you can see that our average occupancy for all of the block faces that are highlighted, we're basically right at 50%. And then this is also a really important number because we do have a mixture of the neighborhoods that are highlighted here is what we call average length of stay. And what you can see there is that the amount of time that cars are parking on average is just at 4 hours, 3.98 hours. And as you kind of look through here, you can see it's a definite red and green where you are red and blue, where you've got basically the car staying between 4 to 6 hours. Now you would anticipate that in our neighborhoods, those lengths of stay would be longer and longer. But I have to highlight, this is for an aggregate of data over a long period of time. So if we started to really drill in by block face, by time of day, day of the week, this is where you really can see the implications and impacts of this. And as we started to break down some of the data, we can break it down by weekday, you can see by weekend, and really looking at that drill down. This is something that is really important when we start to talk about policy changes really influence those decisions, is to really look at the data. And I know up here on the screen, it's very difficult to see because it all just looks like one big blob to me at this point, other than the blue. But that's something that as we dig deeper into this, what I wanted everyone to just know is that this is the resource in our toolbox that we can basically use to help effectively manage parking moving forward. So we mentioned that the survey opened in January, and right now we're slated to keep it open until April 10th. Now, here's the key. We have 195 responses so far, and my hope is that after tonight, word will get out even more, and we can really grow that number, because the more feedback that we have, the more effective and more balanced the solution can be. And it's really important because we're looking for feedback not only on the residential parking permit program and the needs associated with that, but also on the resident parking discount pass, as well as the Monterey locals parking program. So what I thought we would share next, because we really want to focus on the conversation with all of you, is just some of the initial survey results. And I just wanted to show you of that 195. Boy, this is really small. We'll keep that in mind for the next presentation. But I just wanted to give you kind of an understanding of who we're hearing from so far. So from the different neighborhoods that we have the representation from. And then we also asked people to identify if you're living on a street that requires a parking permit. And you can see that right now, the majority of people that have responded are not living in a current parking permit program. And then when they did respond for the parking permit program, you can see that permit zone O, which is which zone, Christy? Oak Grove is really coming out in force with the responses as well, which is great to see. And then, does your street have a time limit for vehicles without a parking permit? That was something also that we dug into, and understanding how long those time limits are. This is something as we talk about tonight too. Are those time limits long enough, or are they too long? And then, how satisfied are you with the process for applying for a parking permit? And you can see of the responses, a good chunk of folks were satisfied with it, and with the next tier being neutral. And then, how many cars does your household have? This is a really important one. So we really hope that we get a lot of responses from people, because this helps us understand the need and the demand that's out there as we talk about it, along with the occupancy numbers. And you can see that a good majority of the households have 2 cars. And when we start to get into 4+, that's when we really got to start putting our thinking caps on. And then how many on-site parking spaces does your household have available? And so seeing that the majority being one, but the majority of people responding have 2 cars, obviously we already have identified one of our challenges. So digging into the data, you can see why having these results will be so helpful. Where do you typically park your car while you're at home? Again, the majority on property or private parking area, but still just about 40% parking on street. These are, again, important details as we get to this. I shared this one because when do you find it difficult to find parking on your block? And you can see evenings really kind of outweighs the locations, but I want to come back to something that I mentioned earlier. When you heard me talk about the big 3 rules of like where most communities will have rules if you're adjacent to a venue, you're adjacent to a neighboring city, or you're adjacent to a business district. This can help dictate if a permit program is designed properly for your neighborhood. For a location that's affected by a high school, for example, your rules might only be Monday through Friday during the school year until 4 p.m. per se. Versus if I'm next to the fairground, it might only be when there's fair events, and it might only be until 8 p.m. a night. I don't know what the rules could be, but things like that. Same with being adjacent to a business district. It might be that the businesses tend to close by 8 p.m., so my business rules maybe could only be until 8 p.m. The reason why I say this is because when you start to talk about a managed parking permit zone, you don't want to handcuff yourself when it affects your quality of life, or maybe when you can have grandma or Aunt Sally come over for supper. You want to keep these types of things in mind, because the more the rules are out there, the more restrictive it also becomes on your lifestyle. Yes, sir.
Any data on ability of and school hours?
So that's actually something, when you saw those data maps, that's actually something that we actually have been collecting the data on that. So we'll be able to really dig deep into those neighborhoods. And as we talk about policies or policy updates that might be needed, enhancements that might be needed to either existing zones or zones that might need to be incorporated into a program. That's something that I think is important to recognize, is there might be opportunities to expand the footprint of a current permit zone, maybe around a high school, for example, and then looking at what those hours are. But that's actually why we had that data, because I wanted you all to see we actually have that information so that you can drill into those details. So that when, yes, to show availability, and basically not only availability, but also what we call utilization. And forgive me for those that were online, the question was, will we have the data associated with these individual block faces or zones? And that's one of the things that we shared on the map, is that we will have that in our toolkit as we talk about assessing these locations as well. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it. Have we solved the problem in terms of being able to create? So the question was, have we ever been able to solve that problem? Is to really be able to custom the hours to meet the needs. Yes. And so that goes into the last example that I'll use. For example, adjacent to a neighboring city, where maybe you're adjacent to a neighboring city where there's large developments and they're tending to spill over into your neighborhood. That might be a community rule where it could be an overnight parking restriction, where you only need a parking permit to be able to park on street between the hours of 2 and 5 a.m. That's a really common rule that a lot of cities employ to try to eliminate those folks that maybe the neighboring city that are parking on our streets, could keep them basically off of our streets, because most people don't want to have to get up in the middle of the night to go move their car. And the reality is they may do it a couple days, but that's not going to be a chronic behavior. And that might be a way to create, I will call it a simple rule that doesn't affect how you live as a resident, that affects the people that maybe want to take advantage of your parking resource. So that's why when we talk about these different rules, it's then creating the operating regulations that support the need. And that's why when we talked about those 3 different implications of a venue, a commercial district, or a neighboring city, you then create the business rules for that permit zone. You know, you check all of those boxes, the petition, you've gone through the occupancy, all of that. Now we create the rules for what that permit zone could look like. And the one thing that we want to try to do is try to have standardization of those permit rules so that for those different types, you really kind of have that standard model so that we also don't have Renee's team running around like chickens with their heads cut off trying to manage your on-street resources. So you want to try to have some unique customization, but also standardization so that if there's one thing I know, parking has to be predictable. It has to be easy to understand because you want people to follow the rules. So you don't want somebody sitting on the street scratching their head trying to figure out, am I even allowed to park here or not? And that's really when we talk about designing the solution. We want it to be something that everyone understands what the expectations are and what the rules are as well. So we're almost through here. Just a couple of opinions that were included here on the options was the modernized on-street parking permit program that I described. You can see that the majority of folks supported the opportunity to self-manage their programs. On permit parking streets, cars without parking permits should be subject to a time limit, like 2 hours, allowing for short-term visits without a guest pass. And you can see that the majority of people supported that. This option was on permit parking streets. Residents should have a limited number of guest passes to give their visitors. Overwhelmingly, 80% said they supported that. And then increase enforcement of permit parking restrictions. This is interesting because you can see that I've got about 30% support, just under that are neutral, and then you got about probably 25% that do not support that. So this is important when we talk about the enforcement, or I like to say compliance, because we want people to follow the rules. But the reality is the consistent coverage to make sure, again, we make it easy for people to follow the rules so that we don't have to write a lot of tickets. And we kept this slide in for now for this first go at the data, was to rank the following investments that were most important to least important in your neighborhoods. And so you can see that they ranked increasing residential parking opportunities, neighborhood beautification, additional mobility options, including bike lanes, and improving maintenance of roads and on-street. So as we go through the survey process until April 10th, we are looking forward to getting more feedback as well so that we can be sure that we have a robust result of survey items. And then we'll take that information and create the recommendations, including the municipal code updates that I mentioned. And ultimately, we're looking to go to City Council in June with the proposed changes to the residential parking permit program. And ultimately, launching the virtual permit program come this July, so that for those of you that are in existing permit zones, we do want to take that program online to provide a convenience for you. So that will tie in there. And then this is where, for anyone that's come to any of our meetings before, and I see several familiar faces, we like to have our parking magic wand exercise. This is what I'm going to ask, because we're streaming online, that if people will come up to the mic to share. I'm also happy to try to repeat what you said, which is if you had a parking magic wand and there was anything that you could change, fix, or improve about parking in the residential areas of Monterey, what would you do? But before we get into that, I wanted to just share this bit of information. It's a little bit dark, but I wanted to make sure everybody has the landing page at haveyoursaymonterey.org/residential-parking-program. And that is where you can get your project updates and any other future information as our schedule moves forward. I also wanted to share our project email address, monterey@dixonresourcesunlimited.com. We look forward to having your all's ongoing engagement. I'm going to leave this slide on the screen so that everybody has access to that. And then what I'd love to do is take our remaining time. I can take questions or comments about the magic wand, or if you all wanted to come up to the mic, whatever's most convenient. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Right now, we have paper passes that are received. I think I did too.
Yep.
And second,
So the intention, it'll be one of the things that we'll look at. Many communities have taken the guest passes online so that you actually can manage your guest passes utilizing the online tool so that you can enter in the license plate of your guest's vehicle. And so the intention is there will be some form of a guest pass. What that looks like or how many there are hasn't been determined yet. That's why the feedback and the occupancy data is going to be so important. And the question for everybody online was, what about guest passes and will they continue? And so still to be determined, but the one opportunity that most communities have done has been able to take that permit process online. Question is, your car is being serviced and now you have a rental. You actually have the opportunity utilizing your online account to go in, and there's actually a category specifically for that, exactly when your car is being serviced, you've had an accident, whatever the case may be. So you can actually go in and input that vehicle information. I also want to share that there's other special types of permits. We call them caretaker permits because, maybe you call them nanny permits in some cases. You have service worker permits, contractor permits. There's a lot of specialized permits. A lot of it depends upon the rules for your permit zone on whether or not those permits are needed. But those will all be the types of things that will come along with this program as well to be able to provide those additional services as well. Yes, sir.
I'm on the planning. Parking comes up quite a bit.
Mhm.
And the housing element, which is gonna drive quite a bit of new housing in Monterey.
Mhm.
So increasing density in particular. I'm concerned that as we go into that, with ADUs and other higher density options for people in the city, that it's gonna become much more difficult. Look at how our current program is implementable in a way that's gonna be fair as neighborhoods change. And we end up having more people looking for places to park because either there isn't an available spot for them at all. Or they're trying to move around the neighborhoods just to find something. So I'm concerned that having a mechanism where it's only limited to a process by which smaller parts of the community are set aside for these
Mhm.
existing programs may not be enough. And it makes more sense, I think, to look at that future where we have higher density and maybe look at having all residential parking on a way governed by some process.
Yep.
As opposed to having, broken out through all different kinds of neighborhoods.
So the comment, thank you for that and sharing that you're on the planning commission, asking about the housing element and really what does the future look like as we talk about these developments and density. My crystal ball is a little fuzzy, I'll be honest with you, but in my experience, if you ask me, within about 5 years, I don't think we'll have parking permits anymore. I just have to be really honest with you all because of exactly what you just described. Is that right now this kind of neighbor on neighbor, block by block challenge? And this is why this element of forgive me for using element, but this aspect of the big three rules that I mentioned, there are some drivers that are affecting the quality of life. But what we have found, based on what you just described, is that establishing that minimum of, in some cases, 4 contiguous blocks is a starting point. And then what we've done in other communities is the adjacent contiguous blocks can apply in to those programs. So your description, it basically means is that you could eventually end up with these very large zones. But what it basically does is it gives you, I'm just going to call it a license to hunt in some cases. But the one thing that I think will drive these opportunities is when you can establish these influencing factors like neighboring city, venue, or business district. But the one thing that we did not talk about today, and we meant to, and I'm going to mention this because many of you are in this location, we haven't talked about the California Coastal Commission as well. And when we talk about how many of you potentially live in a coastal zone, I will share with you in my experience, the Coastal Commission is not one that appreciates residential parking permit zones because again, when we talk about coastal access, and so that's something that's really important when we talk about neighborhoods that are in the coastal zone today. This will become something that we will also have to tackle because the same density challenges and issues that you were describing, we also, in some cases, some of your neighbors will also have that added layer of the coastal commission as well. And having worked with several coastal communities, it is absolutely a challenge when we talk about coastal access and residential parking zone requirements. So that's why when we talk about, again, the standardization of like those three rules, it's helping us be able to justify the cause and effect of why we're making those recommendations. So, but heard on what you described. And that's why when I talk about the magic wand, it's not really magic. I think we can all appreciate that. But the reality of how we're going to manage those density challenges, I see by the looks on these faces, a lot of you have lived here for a while. And I think we can all appreciate with what's happening at the state and in some cases federal level, things are very different now, and they're going to continue to be very different for how we're going to manage parking moving forward. And that's why what we're trying to do is ready the team so that they can be adaptive for that purpose. So, no, thank you for that comment. Sir, I thought I saw your hand up in the back.
We live on a block that's in a coastal zone, and it is a very dense block with single family as well as apartments. So very limited parking. There's no, because it's a coastal, I guess, there's no parking permit. Program on the block. So there's no signage. I just learned recently that we can slowly go on vacation for 2 weeks, which will be frequently. Without using think of a lot. And I was told after visiting when I spoke to the department, I think about this, that if I called in, I was leaving town for up to 10 days, she said, they could call in someone like the department enforcement and have maybe be aware of that particular part.
Right.
But in my mind, that seems really basic in terms of me having to have a vacation, in a sense, ask permission.
Right.
And kind of request that not be taken on blocking. So what you say, how do we deal with that without it being, as you were saying, kind of targeting, the way you were saying, you know, getting a dilapidated vehicle, which might be not,
Right.
kind of block.
Right.
It seems like then you're almost targeting the residents.
Right.
Looking for a way to stigmatize them.
Right.
How do you deal with that? How does it I say more than vacation?
Yep.
I need to be worried about this.
Sure. So for those that are streaming online, the question has to do with, I'm going to go on vacation, the issue of 72-hour violations. How do I address this, invasion of privacy concerns of, me being able to go on those trips and not have to, number one, worry if my car is going to be there when I get back, let alone with citations on it. So one of the things, I don't know if you were in the room yet when I was sharing the state California Vehicle Code basically states the 72-hour violation. It is a state law that's on the books. So one of the challenges, I will say, the grace that was described is not consistent with what I've dealt with in other agencies. So to hear that there's even this opportunity to potentially provide that alert is not something that's commonplace. And that's why when I was sharing earlier, most agencies, in addition to the 72-hour violation, also have regulated street sweeping. So the reality of actually having to move your car every week on a designated period of time is also something that keeps that transition and turnover. That also feeds into this issue of long-term vehicle storage. What I will share is that most agencies will recommend that you find an off-street storage location where you can store your car when you are away for that period of time. I know that's probably not the answer that you wanted to hear, but that truly is what the real burden is because you are not allowed to leave your car on a public street for more than 72 hours. And that is the reality of the rule. And most agencies would say the burden of you storing that vehicle, especially while you're away, does fall on you. So trying to find that location of where to put your car, unfortunately, is part of that challenge. So, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I will say that I've had some agencies where even the police department offers you can bring your car and like store it in their like neighboring lot. I know of that, but it works for that community. So I don't know that that's an option here, but I do think that it's one of those things that, again, because it's a state CVC, California Vehicle Code, that is part of the challenge. So I don't have a fix for you on that one, but I will share, and I shared this with one of your neighbors earlier, is that even with a parking permit program, it does not exclude you from the 72-hour rule. You still have to move your car every 72 hours. There's no exemption to that state code. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that. And then again, with street sweeping regulations, that's also another requirement. It's also how we basically ensure that those cars that maybe you have vehicle habitation challenges or things like that in your neighborhood, we've heard some of those complaints, it keeps those cars moving along as well and not necessarily storing on your block. Yes, sir.
Using potential parking in front of or a user.
So the question was, have we ever experienced someone using the public parking as a used car lot? And I will say yes. How did I solve that problem? A lot of it came down to the enforcement rules, number one. But number two was, and I don't think, did I mention the licensed driver piece? I'll share this with you if I didn't share this. So if I didn't mention this earlier, the city of Cerritos, the city of San Mateo have had this model for about 3 decades now. And we've been using this now for about the last half a dozen years, where only licensed drivers can get a parking permit. So what I was sharing earlier was if I live by myself and I own 4 cars, I am only eligible for 1 parking permit. So that has actually been the way that we've been able to nip that issue in the butt, is because of the fact that you, the used car salesman that you may or may not be, you are only eligible for 1 parking permit and or other licensed drivers in your household. So it has really had an effect. I worked in a community where one fellow lived by himself, had 9 cars, and was juggling all 9 of those cars on the city streets. And this program absolutely eliminated that challenge. So I do think that there are some benefits when we talk about these rules and kind of what they can mean. The guest passes, as you asked about, that is usually where the pickle comes into play, is that with the licensed driver rule, if I have unlimited guest passes or whatever the case may be, that's where we call it the gamification of the parking permit program can come into play. But a lot of cities, and this is why for anybody that's had to live in a permit zone, I'm sure you can appreciate when you start to put restrictions on the number of guests that I can have or the number of parking permits that I can have, that's a quality of life issue that everyone has to be mindful of. Permit programs can sound amazing because of maybe what some of the pros are, but there's also a lot of cons when we start to talk about what that can look like. And that's the reason why when you asked about the housing element and kind of what the future of parking is, only because I deal with especially California cities all up and down the coastline, I really don't anticipate in the long term that residential parking permit programs will be a thing long term in the future. But that's why we want to design this program so that it really is adaptable and fits the needs. And really, when we talk about the hours of operation, the policies, that it really meets your demand. Like, what are we trying to address? Again, if it's a high school, if it's the fairgrounds, if it's the naval post, whatever that case may be, we want to design a solution so that you're not affected by that resource or by that asset, but then that way, but the rules aren't necessarily 24/7 where it handcuffs your ability to have friends over, for a barbecue. Yes, sir.
But I think the important part is like, to Bill's question, is that there has to be a parking program implemented in that area. Again,
There has to be a program in the area.
this in the city, which you do or you don't,
Mhm.
are like you can see in your maps. The area is relatively limited. city,
Right.
then that doesn't work.
Right. So the question just for streaming online is basically incremental versus holistic from the city. And that's why you'll see so many cities that have just a flat overnight parking restriction, but that doesn't do anything for the people that live by the high school or live by, the naval post or live next to Fisherman's Wharf, right? So that's where when you talk about being able to design this, it's about, again, spillover effect. Anybody that doesn't know what spillover effect is in this world today where people have pulled those scooters out of their trunks, those foldable scooters. The reality is where how far people will walk in the past compared to I can go 5 blocks out and just get my little pop-up scooter and zip into wherever I'm going to go. These are the realities of what we're dealing with now when we talk about trying to design a solution that's also designed to be affected by spillover. So, yes, sir.
California State Coordinator for the AARP Smart Driver Program for all seniors.
Great.
I deal with a lot of seniors, and a lot of seniors don't use computers. Here, so you keep saying it's all online, you need to change the verbiage.
Okay.
And you need to have a way of saying that we have another way of getting that right.
That's fair. And so the question is for online so I can keep up with you. ARP representative for the Smart Driver Program, was that what's called? For seniors, appreciate that. And being able to have an option that's not just online, that not everybody necessarily uses a computer. And that's why I wanted to mention that the office is still an available resource. It's just that the majority of folks will tend to use the online service. So, but you were going to say? Sure. Yeah.
Talking about this is license plate.
Mm-hmm.
But Renee just said you're still using trucks. So my question is, how soon will all of the parking vehicles have license plate readers?
In terms of timing, the question was how soon will we have all of the license plate readers? And I will say what Renee described is what I will call our hybrid of where we are in terms of transition and as we update the policies. And that's where the ability to utilize the automated license plate recognition technology. Christy, could you help us address the time frame in regards to the ALPR equipment?
Yeah, so I do want to highlight that we do have 3 of our 9 scooters that currently have the ALPR units on them, and we are in the process of updating the other 6. We have a quote that we're processing right now. I would say within this year if everything goes well.
So we're on track to be able to upgrade it so that all of the vehicles will have it. One more, yes, sir. No, you're all good.
I've been exchanging emails with the city manager, and then I shared this with my neighborhood. I'm the president of the downtown area association. From March 1st until Tuesday of this month, they being the parking, issued 131 72-hour citations. Yeah.
So the comment is that the parking division has issued 131 72-hour violations
March 1st.
from March 1st until Tuesday of this week. So great. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Can you repeat the
Yes. The website where you can basically have, I'll call it the project landing page. It's https:// have your say Monterey. So HAVEYOURSAY, the word Monterey.org/residential-parking-program. And maybe either Lee or Ben, if you maybe could pop over to the computer and just change the font, that might help a lot as well. Julie, yes, ma'am. Sure.
I'd like to end our Oak Grove neighbors, which is my neighborhood. And I'd like to know, because I'm gonna send it to my neighborhood, how many of those 195 responses?
Absolutely. I'm going to ask them to, while they're changing the font, but in a moment, we'll look at that slide and I'll tell you of the 195, what that percentage number roughly is as well. So, and Christy, you're going to add something?
I was just going to say, even if you just Google have your say Monterey, that'll bring you to the main page where there's multiple projects, and the residential parking program is the top project on there. But you can see all the current projects going on, but you can find it that way too, even if you don't type out the whole.
If you go on the Monterey website, I'm sure you can just type in the word parking as well, and it'll take you to your
It
page,
does link to our
which will
page.
link to your page as well. Oh, the flyer has other information on it, right? Okay. So just really quick, when you bring the slides back up, if you can go to the neighborhood slide, please. We're coming back to your answer, and yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was permanent now.
Very small compared. The question was that with the colored map was the areas that are permitted today is very small compared to the entire city boundaries.
And the residents, there are areas that are highlighted, are not really areas where there is significant problems, such as downtown, the North Cannon, Fair Cost.
Yep.
And is that going to become a larger area? What's the idea? I don't understand why it would change.
Sure. So the question was, given the fact that the highlighted map areas were not necessarily the more densely impacted areas, especially Fisherman's Wharf, Cannery, et cetera. So it's one of the reasons why we're actually collecting data and why we're talking about a refresh of the rules so that people that do live in those impacted areas, we want to make sure that folks have the opportunity to participate in these programs. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this process, is not just to address those that currently have a permit program, but to also address the people that need or want a permit program as well. Because as you all can appreciate, a lot of the residential design has changed in some of our areas that where we didn't have as much residential in the past. You're now seeing more residential maybe mixed in with our commercial areas, for example. So we want to make sure that we're helping to tackle those demands as well. Were you able to could you go back? Thank you so much. The slide that has the neighborhoods on it. The question was, I think one or two more, right there. Oh, if you can go that one. So right there, I'd say roughly 28% of the 195, I would say, is me just shooting from the hip on that number. So forgive me for not doing the math in my head, but that's probably about 40 people, give or take, maybe a little plus or minus, or maybe between 40 to 50 of the respondents, give or take. So if that helps. Did I answer your question? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so, question. We got off track when I asked about pricing tickets,
Yes.
but, so seeing your question, SB9 that is allowing multiple lots, residential lots to have additional units built on it, is making the assumption that people are gonna be riding their bikes,
Yep.
or doing a lot of walking. Well, our city, in our county, probably our country, with an aging population,
Right.
that is not going to be biking around. So the assumption of allowing one parking space or 1.5, I think it is with SB9,
Mhm.
is not very realistic or practical. It's not like, the bus in the city with, high school, a lot of high school and college age is that live here permanently.
Right. So that just to summarize for those listening online, the aspect of the aging population, this alternative modes of transportation, the changing demographics, the changing capabilities, et cetera. So I'm going to give you a plug here because the role that you play is so important. And I just have to say this, this is why all of you voting is so important at every level, whether it be city, state, or federal, because these are where the decisions are being made. And a lot of the legislative changes that have happened here in California have happened over the last 6 years. And we're just starting to see the effects of bills that were changed and approved years ago. And people are scratching their head thinking that their local cities are making these changes, whereas these were state codes and these programs and plans have been in play. And now the developments are happening. So I see that across the country and across California, where people suddenly are waking up saying, when did this happen? And so I just have to really reinforce why it's so important that we all pay attention, because there are more rules coming. And I think it's really important when we talk about the effects of some of those policies. Using the comments that you did inquire about parking penalties as well. There's a lot of statutes that have made attempts to get passed at the state level. And there's another one in the works today that would basically allow people to have their parking penalties waived at a very minimal number, which basically creates what I call a scofflaw mentality, because it's basically what I will call your get out of jail free card, because you can just have all of your citations written off. So these are things that I want you all to be aware of, because this will affect whether or not rules can even be enforced. And so.
How was it decided that a parking ticket was $75?
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
As opposed to 35.
Sure. So when we talk about the penalty scales, getting back to your earlier question, so what ends up happening is you look at several factors, including there are certain percentages that are paid to the county and the state for a fine, you know, an increment of that. But what you look at is there are several factors that you look at: comparable rates, comparable agencies, and the opportunity for making sure that people will comply. Because part of the challenge is if the penalty isn't high enough, people will just use that as their parking permit fee. And we find that happening in a lot of agencies. And so what some agencies are doing, and this is something that we haven't talked about here in Monterey, but we'll have this conversation. If you all remember when the seatbelt rules came into play, we had tiered penalties. We're seeing a lot of agencies are actually introducing tiered penalties into their parking citation fine scales as well.
So would it be something that would be doable, for example, in every tourist areas for them to have $75 tickets and residents in their neighborhoods to have $25 tickets?
It's a worthwhile question, and I'll say we'll take that back to the drawing board and see what we can legally do. Typically, from an equity perspective, in my experience, we haven't been allowed to create that type of differentiation. We'll look at it and see what the options are. Well,
versus residents that do.
I don't disagree with your perspective. What I will just share, and the comment for those online was that it's not an equity issue when we're talking about tourists versus residents, but you might have some legal folks that might disagree with that. So that's part of where I will say that we'll definitely take that feedback and see what our options are. The opportunity to look at the part of the challenge that we have is when we talk about a lot of our residential parking permit zones have time limit violations as well, right? So that you have time, so you know where I'm going with this, is that the violation that I would write to Ben for being in violation of the posted time limit in the residential zone is the same time limit violation that I would write him in like the Fisherman's Wharf neighborhood, for example. So does that make sense? Like if in your neighborhood you had a 2-hour time limit sign that's permit exempt, which a lot of your neighborhoods have that have permit zones, when I come up on his car in your neighborhood in violation of that time limit sign, he's actually getting a violation for that time limit violation for being parked in excess of that time limit.
But you
Yep.
so you have, you know, who.
Yeah.
The system knows who lives here and who.
We actually don't. Because remember when I gave you that example of eligible, not eligible? The parking enforcement officer does not look up your license plate. That's important to recognize. And that's when we start to talk about absolute equity issues, is me looking up your car versus his car. He gets a ticket, you don't get a ticket. That.
So you have the license plate number registered
Sure.
in the system.
Right.
If it's in the system, you're a resident.
Right.
That's all. So if you're in the system, you're a resident. And if you're not in the system, you're not.
Right. So I think that in some communities, the question about being able to differentiate between a resident versus a non-resident, there have been opportunities to implement resident benefit programs like your resident discount parking pass, for example. Like this is an exception that a lot of communities won't even touch this. But this is something that in Monterey, we have a program like this. But when it comes to differentiating on the violation types, I will say this, we will take this one to the drawing board and see what is feasible. I'm just sharing in my experience, we haven't been able to differentiate because of equity and balance. It would be an issue of making sure that you have to make sure when we talk about compliance and enforcement, it has to be fair and equitable to everyone. I know as a resident, you may not appreciate that, but it is important that when we talk about the application of the rules, you want it to be fair and consistent. So.
Just real quick,
Sure.
daylighting, why aren't they painting? Because I don't.
Yep, 20 feet.
Well,
Yep. It's about, so it's so the issue about daylighting and why are we not painting? So I just want to give everybody the example of the 20-foot rule is about about a car length. That's really helpful for people to understand that. So as you're out there and trying to figure out how far is 20 foot, it's about a car length. So if that helps you in terms of how far you have to park back from the block face. So what's happening is that agencies aren't painting the curbs because the reality of how many curbs and how many intersections there are, it's countless. And I think at last count, the city and county of San Francisco is trying to paint all of the curbs. If I recall, it's going to take almost 2+ years at a cost of like, I think it's like $1.5 million. They stopped the enforcement of it until because of their community pushback. And I will share with you that every community is handling it a little bit different. And so, Christy, is there anything you can share in regards to daylighting enforcement? Is there anything on the books in Monterey in terms of consideration?
I'm actually going to pass that one to Marissa.
Marissa.
Can you guys hear? This is the first time Mike's been on this side. So at this point in time, we are not going to be painting red curb outside of commercial areas or areas where we are not getting repeated issues for the reasons that Julie mentioned, which is that it is financially not feasible. It is a major maintenance burden. What we have been working between Christy, myself, and the city manager's office is a warning system where we're providing warnings to people. We're providing education. I think I myself have been on the news twice about this issue. And I have also been speaking to other news agencies about this concern. So we are trying to get the word out there about this law. We're not trying to go out and ticket people for this. We're trying to go on the educational route. And really, it's about the education of what the intent of this law is, and it's to provide additional pedestrian safety at intersections. In the same way that you have concerns or comments and questions about laws that come from the state level in regards to housing, in regards to planning, it's the same applies to this law. This is a state mandate that the city is responsible for enforcing. And with the issue of differentiating between residents and non-residents, we have to be fair and equitable about how we implement this law. So that's why we're using the option of warning, of education. Our parking enforcement team, we had a meeting just to talk about the implementation and enforcement of this law. So we could really make sure that we understood it. It's been approved by council in the fee schedule. So there is now a fine on the books, but we do not want to ticket you unless you're a really egregious repeat offender. We really want to educate you first. And we're happy to talk to you about this. You're always welcome to contact Monterey Suggest. If you need the contact information, we do have a card up here that we can provide.
And I know, one moment, I know we started a little bit late, but I'll ask, we'll be able to wrap up maybe a few more comments as well, because I want to make sure everybody has a chance. But I also wanted to acknowledge, I know we're past our scheduled time, but we also started a few minutes late. But yes, sir. Sure, yeah, please come on up. make my life a little easier. What is it?
Nice presentation, and there was some positive things, but there was one thing that has me worried.
Okay.
I'm gonna give a little background. It's kind of the rock and would call it the rock and the hard place situation that we have. In our city, we were, it was always recommended to not take up small lot facing streets, the small dimensions. Not take that up with a lot of driveway. In other words, if you're gonna put in 2-car parking, it starts to take up, the trees go away, and ARC and everything would always promote that you avoid that. So, and there's a lot of places that are just kind of grandfathered in and have always been that way. One car off-street parking, one driveway. So I'm one of those examples. I'm understanding I do know that there's a lot of other people that are in that situation. That's a rock and a hard place with the 72-hour thing. Because you want to have at least one car off street when if you're a 2-car family and all you have is one spot on a narrow lot and so forth. If I were to put in another spot, I'd have to take down an oak tree and some other landscaping, which is part of that aesthetic thing. It also needs a part of a parking area on the side of the street, so it's a functional thing too. Starting to have a street go that way. So there's a lot of the ARC knew what they were doing. There's a lot of reasons for not doing that. So, the other thing quickly on all this rock and a hard place is the state of California has created this rock and a hard place where they're saying 72 hours, but we're going to infill, we're going to put in ADUs and so forth. That doesn't make sense because there's not going to be parking places for those ADUs. So there's a lot of rock and a hard place situations in this city, older city and so forth. Now, my magic wand for this city in particular, I think that one of the things that I pulled out of this was that we're supposed to be seeing a warning before the citation, but I know that that's not exactly happening. So that's something that maybe the city could make better. A warning in time to act on the possibility of a citation. In other words, I've gone over 72 hours. They've warned me. I need to do something about it. That would work. That would not be abused that I can see. So that's one thing. The other thing is right now what the city's doing is they're doing a wide net sweep. I don't understand that. I don't understand why you need to do that. It's kind of like you're trying to be polite to the person who's parking the car for a very long time, despite in spite of what the entire street is having to deal with. So why not target? Why not target? I don't understand that. Why do a full street sweep or a cast a wide net? So that's another magic wand that I would put out there. Now, the third one I'm not sure about because you had kind of thrown a monkey wrench into what I thought was a solution, because I know other cities have been doing this, other communities, but apparently the state of California is not supporting it, and that is a permit that allows you a second car off street if you cannot accommodate. I'm sorry. A second car on street if you cannot accommodate off street. So if you have just the single spot, you can apply for a permit, and this could be through the whole community and take care of like the 70-car example and so forth, that would allow for an extended period for that second car.
And if you have a location that you're familiar with that has that authority and that permit, please drop us an email, contact the parking department, because I don't know of any city in California that allows that exception, but you bring us an example forward, we'll be happy to check on that. And I also want to let you know, we'll go back to the parking department and talk about warning notice versus citation, have that dialogue and conversation. So I appreciate your feedback on that. And then obviously the impact of that second vehicle. Just like the fellow that wants to be able to go on vacation, he's left now. But I mean, those are real world challenges. So it's something that we'll definitely see what options that we can introduce. But if you can identify a city in California that has that exception, please email on the website.
You got two drivers in the house that would be able to qualify the second car. You have it with a permit, so it's like, it's.
No, he wants to be able to park an exception of the 72-hour rule. That's what he's saying. He wants to be able to have a permit that allows you to stay on street beyond the 72 hours. And that's what we're saying. That's a California vehicle. That's a state law. Yeah.
Thing, right.
I was
But-
thinking, say, because you only have one parking space in your.
Yeah.
We're not in, we're also not in a place. As
Yeah, but just anybody who only has one
Right.
space and has two drivers.
Right.
Two vehicles, one should be expected to be in the driveway and the other.
On the street.
Permitted to be on. the
Yeah.
street.
Right. So I think his is an exceptional situation. But if you can identify a city, we will be happy to interrogate those options and look at those for sure. So.
Okay, I did read about this on other communities. I think people state.
Yep, if you can bring it up, please. I said, I've been doing this a really long time and I haven't found one yet. I won't claim to know it all.
Can't be the-
Well, I will say this, that it will require some state actions in order to do that, because there are certain things regarding the California Vehicle Code that we can't necessarily negate. Because but if you can find it and there's a thread, we can pull on it and see what the options are. So who knows, right? Anything else?
Yeah, just one last thing, their vacation thing, I've used it and I wish the guy was still here, but it works really well.
Okay.
So that's one positive.
Great feedback that the vacation alerts work. Yes, ma'am, you had your hand up.
Downtown, price of parking tickets faster last year. And downtown parking, we've got, tourism we rely upon, right, which brings cars into the downtown area. But additionally, you've got a lot of people that live here
Mhm.
and will avoid the downtown, go on shop down there because parking.
Great.
So we go up to Belmonte, we go over to Grove, whatever.
Mhm.
And recently I got a ticket because I have a business downtown. And I parked on the street, I went to grab lunch, got a cup of coffee, dropped a check at the bank, came back. 10 minutes over the limit, 1 hour, okay? And wham, $49. So my question is, Alvarado has a 90-minute zone, which is Tallahassee and all the other side streets, right, are at 1 hour.
Mhm.
And so for you to conduct any business, shop downtown, go to your thing, take care of real business of living here in Monterey,
Mhm.
people are not doing it, but live here.
Yep.
Or that. So when you're looking at, the parking blocks, et cetera, I think that's something that should be considered. Some kind of extra permitting and decal something. So that those of us that are like downtown can do.
So the question really has to do with the time limits, especially in what I will call our commercial areas. I'm going to say something, and again, I know we're at the end of our night, but one of the things to think about when you talk about the ability to stay longer really comes down to paid parking. Is your ability to have parking meters that allow you to stay for longer? That's something that has been bandied about for a long time in some of those locations as well. We'll definitely take that feedback, and especially as we've been evaluating the occupancy in those areas, that's really when you start to talk about turning the dial of being able to modify or adapt those time limits. One of the challenges, and I'll just hopefully, if anybody else has any comments, or we're really at that time, is when we talk about the parking theory, as I'll throw this out here. On street is your premium parking, and off street is where you're supposed to park when you want to stay and, extend your time and be able to shop about, etc. And so that's the reason why we do have the time limits that we do, is because it's intended. The basic rule is that premium parking every parking space in our commercial district is intended to be a wallet, so that you park, spend your money, and then move your car so that the next customer can come in, park, and spend their money. And then the folks that want to stay longer are supposed to park in the off-street locations.
Is that extended area that typically.
Yep.
Residents know about in Bird Park, and now you can.
You park there. Okay, well, I'll take,
But we're seasonal, right?
sure.
So in our area, we tend to encourage locals to visit the businesses.
Yep.
That the tourists would normally go to get them over the non-tourist season.
Right.
I don't know if, you know, I mean, that's counterproductive, and the city just did a economic development study session last night.
Right.
And of course, you want to be able to encourage residents to, you know.
Yeah.
Visit, you know, these businesses and support them through, you know, and so by having these residents not have the ability to come down here.
Yep.
You know, I don't know if it's off season or what, but it's, you know, you want to encourage business. I wish Jean hadn't left, since she's a council member and she was actually the one that brought it up last night.
Okay.
That
Christy, we're gonna-
shop local and all of that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna shop local if I have a chance of getting a $50
Are
parking.
you gonna take it? Christy, we're gonna have some,
I was going to add in the downtown, we do have 2 parking garages, our west garage and our east garage. The first hour is free. What was that? Oh, in the Calle Principal. But in the downtown garages, we offer the first hour free in that location. And then it charges if you stay over that. We also have our Monterey resident discount parking program. And so if you have that permit, it'll give you 2 hours free in the downtown garages. So, and then if you're over the 2 hours, you would just pay for the stay that over that time frame.
Certain lots, though, they're no.
There is good for the downtown garages, the waterfront lot and Cannery Row. So in our 3 main districts, there's 1 lot in each location that provides that 2 hours free.
which means that we are also well over our time. So I first and foremost want to thank everyone that's online, but more importantly, also here in person. Thank you for tolerating our overrun. I really just want to reinforce again, they changed the color of the font now, so hopefully everybody can see the haveyoursaymonterey.org/residential-parking-program. Our project email address, monterey@dixonresourceslimited.com. You can also contact the parking division at any time. And right now we're targeting June for city council, but please take note, April 10th is the date for the survey to close. Please get out there, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, please go online and fill out the survey. And thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate your feedback. And again, we'll look forward to keeping you apprised, and feel free to take some flyers for anybody that needs to know more about the resident discount parking pass. Thank you all very much.
Want to extend it like that, if you want to get more than 200 people, because I mean, people who